Welcome to Free Speech Nation, the podcast with me, Andrew Doyle. I'm delighted to welcome my guest today, Anne Widdecombe. Anne has had a long and varied political career, serving as a Conservative MP, a minister in 3 departments, a member of the Shadow Cabinet, and a Brexit Party MEP. She's also well known for her appearances on Strictly Come Dancing, Have I Got News for You, and also was a runner-up in Celebrity Big Brother. Thank you for joining me, Anne.
Great pleasure. Good to be here.
It's quite clear from that little bio that you are one of those politicians that crosses the line into celebrity culture. Do you see it as a kind of extension of your political career? Are there transferable skills there?
No, I absolutely don't. Though I often say, obviously just as a joke, that there's a huge analogy between Westminster and pantomime, which I now regularly do.
Yes, you're a panto performer
in
now.
the winter.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I often make that joke, but in fact, I mean, there was no conscious crossover on my part at all. I finished at Westminster, and I had turned down Strictly Come Dancing, who'd come to me every year since 2004.
Right.
I retired in 2010. Every year they came to me, every year I said, no, it's inappropriate, absolutely not. Then as soon as I knew I was going to retire, I said, well, why not? I can now.
Yes.
And that just spawned everything. I mean, from Strictly Come Dancing came the tour, came pantomime with Craig Revel-Horwood, and then it just snowballed from there. So it was never intended. I didn't say to myself, I'm going to have a celebrity career. I said, I'm going to retire to Dartmoor and, and write and enjoy walking on the moors and things.
So it happened by accident?
It happened by accident.
Was there a reason, do you think, why you were continually asked to be on these shows? Why, for instance, would they choose you rather than some other politician? Because there must be something about you that that appealed.
Well, I mean, I think they're probably the best people to answer that. I mean, I think the reason to get me on Strictly was pretty obvious. I mean, I was the most ungainly person on the planet.
Right.
I was never going to dance my way anywhere at all. But they were desperate to have a politician. Now, the interesting thing is the attitude of the journalistic profession when I agreed to do Strictly, and I was the first politician to do it, though we'd had John Sargent as a reporter, but I was the first politician, was that this was inappropriate, it was humiliating, it was degrading, I shouldn't be doing this at all. When a few years later Ed Balls did it, all that had gone.
Yes.
So in a way, I set a precedent that was finally accepted.
Well, it certainly changed the perception of politicians, and because if I think back to, say, when George Galloway went into the Big Brother house, he was universally slammed in the press for doing so, and his whole... Well, he claimed that his view on that was that he wanted to go in order to reach...
Talk about respect.
Talk about politics and that kind of thing. By the time you had been on Strictly Come Dancing, that changed things. People started thinking maybe it's okay for politicians to show their fun side, I suppose. I
always took the line that you only do it when you leave. I mean, as I say, I turned down Strictly. I did some other things, but they were a bit more dignified. And I turned them down year after year after year. I certainly wouldn't have done Big Brother or The Jungle or any of those while I was a serving politician. But my view was, if you've left, you've left.
Yes.
And you're entitled to live your life as you want to live your life, and you don't have the duties that you had as a politician. As I put it, I no longer owed anybody any duty of time or dignity.
It's a bit like when you talk to politicians once they've left, they can often be more open about what they believe. They're not sort of held back by the party whip or anything like that, and it can be quite liberating, I think. But there is something about the nature of political figures that a lot of people expect them. You mentioned dignity.
Yeah.
But there is a certain type of politician now who's quite popular. Take a Donald Trump kind of figure.
Yeah.
Who crosses the line from celebrity to politician from the very outset. And to what extent do you think that's happened here? Well, I mean, I think back to Tony Blair had a very presidential style about him, and since then it's almost considered a help rather than a hindrance to have that popular appeal as well as retain the dignity of the role. Do you think there's a danger here?
Yeah, I think several things have changed. I think television has changed things massively.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think back to the days, of Harold Macmillan, I mean, you would have a reporter meeting the plane, and they would say, "Oh, Mr. Macmillan, can you comment on so and so?" And he would say no.
Yes.
And that was it.
And that was
end of it. He was allowed to say no. We're now at the stage where you cannot say no, and what is more, people want instant reactions. I vividly remember when William Hague made me Shadow Health Secretary, and I went outside, and he'd called me to Central Office. I came outside Conservative Central Office, massive press there. And they all said the same thing. They all said, "Well, Miss Widdecombe, what is your health policy?" And I said, "I haven't a clue." I said, "I haven't been here 2 minutes, I've walked from up there to down here, and of course I can't tell you my health policy. And I was expecting the headlines the next day to be haven't a clue. But
Yes.
in fact, it was such an unusual reaction that they just went with it.
I think people are relieved when they sense just complete honesty
Yeah.
from a politician.
I mean, I didn't have a policy then. I said
Yeah.
to them I wouldn't have a policy for some weeks.
So going back to your political career, as you say, the celebrity aspect of stuff came later, and that was by accident almost. If we go back, why did you want to? Did you always know that you wanted to get into politics? This is very vocational for you?
Yes, I mean, I wanted to be a politician from a very early age, about 14. For all the wrong reasons then, because I was the post-war generation, and of course, at that stage, and it's difficult to remember now, but all the films, all the plays, all the books, they were all about the war. The whole thing was about the war.
Yes.
And of course, the towering character was Winston Churchill. And I think I seriously thought then that this is what politicians did, that they made great speeches and saved the world.
Yes.
Quite a good way of spending one's life. By the time I was 20, I had a much more realistic appreciation of what a politician actually is and does. The desire to do it never left me. And in those days it took time. You weren't fast-tracked because you were a woman or anything like that. I fought, my first election was in 79. I fought a northern mining town. And then my next one was marginal against David Owen down in Devonport. And then finally the safe seat, which I then held throughout my political life. So I was 39 and a half before I got into Parliament. I always used to say life begins at 39 and a half. So I had a long, long apprenticeship, and regrettably, you don't get that so much now.
And do you think then, from what you're describing, you had a kind of romanticised view of what it is to be a politician?
Oh, when I was very young, I did, yes. But I mean, that didn't last very long. It certainly wouldn't survive your first campaign.
No.
But of course, I was doing all the voluntary stuff as well, the party positions locally and local council and all that sort of thing.
Did you have anything in particular that you wanted to change in society? Did you see things that were wrong that you thought you might be able to make a difference through politics?
There were lots of things that I would have said, I would do this differently. And then, of course, when you get there, very often, I mean, I went in with a terrific interest in defence. I'd been Vice Chairman of Women and Families for Defence, which had been set up to counter the Greenham Common people. I'd written a pamphlet on defence. Everybody assumed when I went into Parliament that I would do Defence Select Committee, and, no, it went the other way. I never did do defence. Now, I think I and everybody around me expected that I would, so you never know.
Right, because I was talking to Baroness Hoey about politics. It was her view that there's a significant degree of careerism now within Westminster.
Huge.
Which wasn't necessarily always the case. So you think she's right?
I think she's 100% right. I noticed a huge change in my time. First of all, from the quality of MP. When I first went into the House, I mean, in our intake, for example, there was a brain surgeon on the Labour side, Sam Galbraith. There was a consultant gynaecologist on our side, and we just took it for granted that Parliament recruited at that level. You had very big men still at that time. You wouldn't expect it now, but from the war.
Yes.
I mean, people like Gary Neve were just before me, but we had those sorts of people. Bob Boscawen, who'd been trapped in a burning tank. If you look round the House of Commons now, to find that level of achievement prior to coming into politics is actually pretty. It's not unheard of, but you wouldn't be able to count up much more than on the fingers of one hand or so. I think the quality's changed, and there are several reasons for that. One is the obsession now on the part of both major parties with effectively quotas. We must have women, we must have gays, we must have ethnics, we must have this, we must have that. They've done that not by encouraging the meritorious to come forward, but by open discrimination in favour of anybody fitting a category. And I give you a good example of this. When I left, I watched the selection, obviously, for my seat. And we reached a point where we wanted to put into the final 3 men and 1 woman. That was it. We were told we couldn't do that. So we said, well, why not? Because the next woman is quite a long way down the list. Plenty of men in between. No, you can't do that. You've got to have an equal number on the shortlist. And I actually said to the Central Office agent, are you telling us that we cannot select on merit? And he very truthfully said, I'm afraid so, yes.
That's interesting because it's often not openly admitted.
No. Well, it's true.
So when
I saw it.
When Labour, for instance, have all-female shortlists and the like, do you feel that, I mean, their argument would be that there are kind of structural imbalances in place within Westminster, and they need to be rectified through effectively positive discrimination. But you would say that meritocracy would work if applied.
It has to be through merit. It can only be through merit. You cannot get into Parliament just because you fit into the right category of person that they happen to be looking for at the time. And my big beef with all women shortlists is, effectively, you are saying to a male candidate who's grown up in that area, who's brought his own children up in that area, who knows it like the back of his hand, he's used the local health services, local education, you're saying to him, sorry chum, you can't even put your hat in the ring because at the end of it, we've reserved this for a woman.
Do you think there's a reason why women tend not to go into politics at the same degree as men?
Oh, I mean, I know it's very, very unfashionable to say it.
By all means, say it.
But yeah, I will. It is a fact of life that women have the lion's share of the caring responsibilities in families. I mean, it's women who give birth, not men. It's women who breastfeed. It's women who look after small children at that stage. And it doesn't always, it can sometimes, but it doesn't always go with politics. I mean,
right.
Take the obvious problem, which is distance. And if you've got a constituency in Yorkshire and a young family, and you're meant to be during the week in London, how on earth do you manage that? Do you shift the family around? Do you leave them to a carer? What do you do? You know, how do you do it?
Yes. See, I often wonder about the I don't know if you recall Harriet Harman having a pink bus to try and entice women into politics, and I. Some of this anti-meritocratic stuff strikes me as quite patronising, you know, because if a woman wants to get into politics, then why shouldn't she honour her merit?
I once said this in the 1922 committee when David Cameron had gone on about, you know, how we had to promote women, etc. And he introduced, in order to do it, he didn't have all women shortlists, he had the A list.
Okay.
And I stood up and I said, how dare you tell me that you're going to do me a special favour in order that I can come into this place. I said, I got here on the same basis as you, Sunshine. I didn't say Sunshine, but, you know, but that was the tone of my response. And I think it's so important for women's dignity that every single woman in the House of Commons can look every single man from the Prime Minister downwards in the eye and to know that she got there on exactly the same basis as he did. Otherwise, she's a second-class citizen.
It's interesting to hear you talk this way because these are the kind of views that I think certain figures on the left use to attack you, to say that you're...
Oh, they do.
I mean, the Guardian...
They say I'm anti-woman.
Yeah, things like that. And the Guardian says you have an authoritarian appeal, hard right views, and they've even called you a throwback to pre-war imperial Tories. What would you say in response to those kind of descriptions?
Well, I think they're facile. That's what I would say, you know, very Guardian-esque.
I mean, very predictable of the Guardian, if I may say so.
Very predictable and just totally facile. And so, I mean, I can't comment beyond that. Yeah. I always say, you know, people sometimes write to me and say, you think this, you think that. I say, and your evidence?
Yes.
Yeah, and your evidence for what I apparently think.
I know I've noticed that a lot more over the last few years, this growing tendency, particularly from leftist commentators, to assume that they know what you are secretly thinking.
They know what you think on overseas aid. I mean, I had that the other day when I was debating with somebody, and it was Andrew Adonis. He knew exactly. He thought what I thought about overseas aid. He was wrong. And
did he back down once you'd corrected him, or did he?
I think he rather said sarcastically, "Oh, good, I'm glad you think that." Or
okay.
Something like that.
Because you sometimes surprise people. I mean, you've even had people on the left cheering you on for your proposals for prison reform.
Yes, absolutely.
For instance, which that sort of confounds expectations.
Well, I don't understand people who don't understand that rehabilitation isn't, as I said at party conference, some soft, wet, liberal, optional extra. It's a most crucial tool of public protection. And if we do not spend money on rehabilitating prisoners and do not put the focus on that, then the people who leave the prison gates are bad, or usually worse, than the people who came in.
Yeah.
And that creates more victims. It creates the need for courts and sentences. It creates, therefore, hugely additional expenditure. What is the point? What is the point of being against a focus on rehabilitation? Well,
it seems actually as quite a conservative viewpoint, really, because what you're saying is this is not just for the betterment of the individual, but for the betterment of society.
It's in everybody's interest. It's in the prisoner's interest. It's in the prisoner's family's interest. It's in the interest of the potential victims, who, if he's rehabilitated, will not be the victims.
Yes.
You know, it's in everybody's interest. Why can't people see that?
So in terms of some of the views that you have that have been considered controversial, they tend to tie in with your religious belief, don't they? Things like your views on gay marriage, abortion, this kind of thing.
Well, no, abortion does not tie in with my... I mean, it does because there is Catholic teaching.
Yes.
But the fact is that I was against abortion when I was an Anglican, when I was an agnostic, and now I'm a Catholic. And my view has not changed throughout.
Right.
Because, as far as I'm concerned, there is never, well, in very exceptional circumstances, but there's pretty well never, a reason to take a life. And now that we've got it up to birth, and of course we've got this challenge now going on in the courts from the Down syndrome people, quite right too that they should be challenging it, we're actually saying that you can abort a child who's only a few days off being born, who is no different from the child who's going to be born, who's exactly the same. Mm-hmm. You can't see it at the moment, and therefore it's okay to do it. Now that's so wrong. As a result of joining David Alton's big pro-life campaigns towards the end of the 80s and 1991. As a result of joining that, I came into contact with Catholics en masse, so to speak, for the first time since I'd left a convent school at the age of 18. That really was what started me on the path towards Catholicism. So in a way, I'm a Catholic because I'm pro-life, not pro-life because I'm a Catholic.
And you were at a convent school that was an Anglican convent school?
No, it was Roman Catholic.
Oh, it was? But you were an Anglican?
I was an Anglican.
Okay, I wondered if it fell into the kind of high Catholic, high Anglican tradition.
No, evangelical family.
Okay.
And in fact, it's where I learnt, I always say to stick up for myself, because I was in a minority in that school. Obviously, it was Catholic school.
Yes.
And I was not only a Protestant core, I was an evangelical one. So I learned to stand up for my minority position.
How did that go down? Did you ever
they expected that. No, they were very good, the nuns. They expected you to stand. If all the children in a form preferred one poem and you preferred another, they wanted you to say so.
Really?
Yeah, they really wanted you to say so.
I was at a convent school. My nuns weren't like that.
Oh, mine were Sacred Heart nuns. I don't know.
Maybe that makes a difference. That's very interesting. So there was, in spite of the religious bent of the school, there was a sense of tolerance, or a tolerance for different views.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, there wasn't, because, for example, we had to go to Mass if we were boarders, which I was. Mm-hmm. We had to go to Mass on Sundays as opposed to, going out to our own service. So from that point of view, the tolerance was limited, but they never, ever in that school had an ethos of suppressing what you think. Mm-hmm. You said, respectfully, but you said what you thought.
And your conversion to Catholicism came later, so
93.
So do you think that there were any seeds sown in those early days? No,
because the Catholicism that I knew was pre-Vatican II.
Right.
It was very strict. It was pretty intolerant, actually, in terms of religion. And I left confirmed as a Protestant.
Yes.
Both literally and metaphorically, confirmed as a Protestant.
Well, a Catholic post-Vatican II is a very different beast, actually.
Totally different beast. And I didn't meet it until I went, because one of my friends at school actually entered a convent, became a nun, and I went to the service for her final vows, and the church had changed. I mean, it was in the vernacular, they had music, and the priest didn't have his back to the people.
Yeah.
The whole thing had changed. So it was very, very different sort of Catholicism.
Did that appeal to you more?
Yes. Yes, I've never felt easy. I mean, I do occasionally go to a Tridentine Mass, priest with his back to the people, and I feel I'm not participating in this. I'm not part of this.
Yes, I think the changes at the Second Vatican Council were for the good.
I do too.
And certainly did broaden the appeal of the church. Yeah. Do you think, so in terms of your views on gay marriage and Section 28, those I presume are tied to your religious perspective?
Well, no. They are views that I would have held anyway.
So can you talk us through that? So let's take Section 28. Do you still stand by that view that you feel it was a good idea?
We did it for the protection of children. We wanted children to be taught the marriage model.
Yes.
And that was what we wanted them taught. It was not an age in which you taught them every last variation that there might be. And it was only ever about promotion. It was never about explanation. It was never about preventing bullying. It was never about that.
So would you have been against a teacher mentioning the reality that there are gay people in society?
Oh, good heavens, no. I mean, I would have expected a teacher to say that. I would have expected a teacher to say that at an appropriate age.
Because I think a lot of people feel that Section 28, or at least a lot of the teachers at the time, felt unable or claimed that they felt unable to do even that?
It, but they weren't. They were never unable to explain. I say there's a huge difference between explaining and promoting. And they were never prevented either from intervening in bullying, where that was a source of bullying, which it certainly was. There's a lot of misunderstanding about Section 28.
So do you feel, though, I mean, I suppose the counter-argument to that is if young people don't feel able to talk about their sexuality or don't ever hear about it in schools, it's going to make their lives a lot more difficult. Would you say that that's a fair perspective?
No, I don't think that's true, because I don't think it depends on school. I have always believed that sex education and relationship education is most properly taught at home. And parents will have 2 children, and they may tell one things at 14 and the other things at 10.
Yeah.
Because they will make the judgment on the child. And I think that is so important. And the government is, not this government, governments, have just taken that responsibility away from parents.
And do you think that more generally, that actually parents should be taking more responsibility,
Yes.
and that the schools shouldn't intervene so much?
I do. I feel that very, very strongly. Unless you believe there's a reason to intervene, i.e. you believe there's a child having a difficult time at home because of some issue, maybe around sexuality, maybe around whatever it is, then of course you can intervene. But I think in general, parental responsibility. You know, what are parents for?
The points that you're outlining here have often been simplified to a simple kind of, oh, well, Anne Widdecombe must be anti-gay or against gay or homophobic. And it strikes me as it looks like a different perspective.
Well, I have a lot of gay friends. Now, that is not the issue. The issue is they have me as a friend.
Right.
And I once challenged Ian Doyle on his LBC programme, and I said, Ian, if I thought one half of the things that people think I think, would you want to know me? And he said no.
Interesting.
And that, I think, is crucial. And the interesting thing was that, you know, when I went through a time when I was having shows cancelled and there was gross distortion of something that I'd said, when I went through all of that, the people on the telephone, the people sending the emails to me were my gay friends saying, don't take any notice of this.
So I'm very interested in that. A lot of people are misrepresented and mischaracterised. I see it more now than I ever did before. It's almost just a given, or it's a strategy that has become so commonplace. How does that make you feel? Because there's nothing you can do about it, is
There's
there?
absolutely nothing you can do. I mean, I can't do anything about the fact that an awful lot of people are totally convinced, I mean, wholly convinced, that it is an established fact that I chained women up in childbirth. I mean, they really think it. I mean, I actually said in the Commons, on the record, it's never been the policy of either any minister or the prison service to keep people secured during labour or childbirth. During labour or childbirth. Clearly, there, on the record.
Yes.
And yet people think they know something completely different.
Why do you think this has happened? Why do you think people are more interested in battling a mischaracterisation, something in their minds?
I think people do not read the news or listen to the news with the attention that they would direct if they were doing a comprehension test. So things sort of go in and out. So they see the headlines about pregnant women are secured between prison and hospital. They think, oh, you know, therefore they are secured in childbirth. Well, nobody's ever actually said that.
And then that sticks.
That sticks. Because they haven't applied comprehension to it. I mean, I often say this, somebody will write and say, I said such and such a thing. And I say, go and watch the interview and then tell me what I said. Some of them will then apologise.
Yes. To what extent do you make the effort to correct erroneous perceptions, or do you just let it go?
I let it go.
Okay.
I let it go. I mean, if somebody actually, you know, emails me or writes to me, I will answer that.
Yeah.
But in general, no, it's an absolute lost cause. You know, short of taking out a libel action and going to the courts, and I've been driven very close before now.
Yes.
Short of doing that, there is nothing you can do.
That's probably good advice because
let it go.
Everyone's in this position now. I want to ask you a bit about you gave a very, very powerful speech at the Oxford Union about free speech. And that's been viewed a lot online.
And they voted for it.
Yes, so you won them round. Because there is a perception, isn't there, that actually the students are the hardest ones to win round on this question.
Oh, I expected to lose, but we won by miles. You know, it wasn't just a narrow win; it was a huge win, huge victory.
Yes.
Standing ovation as well. So, I mean, we really won, but that was in the Oxford Union, which is given over to debate and to controversial debate and all the rest of it. And I think maybe it was the most likely student place that you were going to win that argument. But I really did think, and I thought, up to about halfway through the debate, I thought, we're going to lose this.
Yes, because I've spoken recently to an academic at Cambridge, actually, who was telling me that his students are quite frustrated because they perceive it to be actually a minority of students who are against free speech, but they are the ones that go into student politics and they're the ones that make the most noise. And so maybe there's a misperception of the younger generation that actually it's just the louder ones that we're hearing from.
I mean, I think that is true, and I think it's also true of the Twitter rows that you get. You get companies suddenly withdrawing their advertising or changing their policy. And it's quite obvious what's happened. Some press man has rung up. He's got somebody from the PR department. He hasn't got the managing director. He's got somebody from the PR department who thinks, must calm all this down and must say we're going to review it and we're going to look at it. It makes it almost worth the while of that tiny minority to kick up a fuss.
Because they always win.
Because they frequently win. Now, we've now got a pushback. We've got GBNews, we've got the New Culture Forum, we've got things going on. We're setting up our own institutions to combat the long march through the institutions, as it's called. There is now a pushback, and I think that's pretty important. And really the way to do it was what happened with Ikea and GBNews.
Yes.
And Ikea withdrew advertising because a few woke people complained.
It was just a couple of tweets, I think.
Yep. Very tiny number of people complained, drew the advertising, knee-jerk reaction. Suddenly, people said, OK, well, we won't buy Ikea. We're not going into Ikea. And there was such a backlash that, as you know, it reversed the decision.
Yes.
That's what we need to do. We need actually to employ consumer power and say, OK, you can do that, but don't expect me to come in your shop.
So the boycott can work both ways.
Boycott can work both ways.
Yes, exactly. It's interesting you mentioned there the idea of the long march through the institutions. So to what extent do you think that our major institutions, political, cultural, educational, have been to an extent captured by an ideology?
Well, they have been. You only have to look at the BBC, and it is hugely left-wing, and it isn't even conscious bias. I mean, their attitude towards Brexit was very, very illustrative of the whole problem. They could not believe, and this is what BBC insiders themselves say, they could not believe that the nation dared to vote to leave the EU. Well, the nation did dare because there's a nation outside the metropolitan elite. And I think education, I mean, the case has been made that it was Rudi Dutschke in the 60s who talked about the long march through the institutions, and it would be a long one. But they began with teacher training.
I'm always a bit wary of the idea because it sounds conspiratorial. Of course, when the likes of Dutschke were talking about it, they did have I mean, it's not conspiratorial because they were outlining this plan explicitly.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I do wonder sometimes whether this hasn't happened more by accident, more that one thing after another. You think it's...
Most things happen by accident.
Okay.
But I think they saw an opportunity. They embarked upon that opportunity. A lot of things then fell their way. And it's just gone on insidiously ever since.
But it's interesting to hear people like Tim Davie, the new Director General, saying that he wants to address that issue within the BBC. Do you think it's possible at this point? Because I speak to people within the BBC who say that it's too far gone and it can't be pulled back.
Well, that's why you need your own long march. What you have to do is to say, OK, this has been taken over by... I wouldn't even say lefties. I haven't got anything against lefties. It's the woke and the intolerant and those who don't want anybody else's opinions to be heard that I object to. And you have to say, right, well, this has been taken over by people who have that sort of view. Gradually, what we've got to do is, and this is why education is so important, because the newcomers are coming in from the universities, they're coming in from the schools, and that's where you've got to get the notion of free speech.
Because I don't see it in terms of left and right particularly, insofar as I'd say I have more economically left-wing views. I think the idea of free speech, though, for instance, is that should be embraced by left and right.
Absolutely.
And actually, what we're dealing with more is a movement which is obsessed with identity politics. Which doesn't sit well to me with a traditional left-wing perspective. I can't imagine the likes of Tony Benn being obsessed with identity and not class, for instance,
No, well, he would have been obsessed by class, but that is a form of identity politics.
Right, okay.
There's them and us. That's identity politics. Whether you're talking about rich and poor, or black or white.
But there are tangible opportunities that come out of money in a way that aren't necessarily true for... Or certainly more true.
But it's still a form of identity politics. I mean, I agree with you. I think identity politics is the problem. But it's also this fostering all the time of grievance.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I'm furious on behalf of women because I think we've been really sold short. Our attitude in the 70s was, and you know, and I amaze the younger generation in my family by telling them this, but in the 70s, when I was graduating, it was perfectly lawful, absolutely lawful, for an employer to advertise a job with 2 rates of pay underneath, one
Yes.
for men, one for women. That was lawful. It was lawful to deny a woman finance for no other reason that she was a woman. It was lawful to say we're only employing males. All lawful. And our attitude then was, and I was very much part of this at the time, if we can have a level playing field, we will show you that we're as good as, and in some cases better than, the men. Just give us the level playing field.
Mm-hmm.
In the 90s, that became completely distorted into tilt the playing field towards us. We haven't made it on a level playing field. We now want it tilted towards us. We want to make sure that we have all women shortlists. You know, women should do this, women should do that, quotas for the boardroom. That's a sellout. Mm-hmm. That's effectively saying we haven't made it. And now we want the men to patronise us and to smooth our paths for us. And that was never my idea of women's lib. My idea of women's lib was we go for it on exactly the same basis as the men go for it.
And do you consider yourself a feminist?
I was that sort of feminist.
Okay.
I'm not a 90s feminist, because 90s feminism and what has followed it is all about whinging and grievance and, you know, demands for special treatment. Special treatment is an insult. I do not want special treatment from anybody. I'll compete with you any day of the week.
I'm sure you would.
And you might win, I might win. Wouldn't matter as long as the playing field's level. Wouldn't matter.
So do you feel that tied into that is there needs to be a greater sense of stoicism cultivated in society?
There should be a greater sense of stoicism, I mean, everywhere. Yeah. We are, you know, I mean, there's an article in the paper that, you know, bald men are now going to need counselling because they're going bald. God help us all. You know. And I mean, yeah, I mean, there is very serious stress. I mean, I do think if you've been in combat, you've probably got it. But going bald, good heavens above, come on,
I suppose
guys.
If that's the only problem you have, then you're doing pretty well, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
But this does bring us on to this idea of grievance narratives and the idea of victimhood almost.
Yeah, victimhood.
Was a way to get status, oddly. You know, that there's a kind of power in victimhood now, which wasn't there before. And this, I think, does connect to your debate on free speech, because one of the main tactics of those who want to shut down other people's speech, as far as I can see, is to say that speech makes them feel unsafe.
Unsafe.
And that actually it's a threat to them to even hear the opinion aired.
Or if you walk past a statue, you know.
Or if you see a statue
represents somebody. Well, I mean, I walk past Cromwell's statue every day, and I would dearly love to push it over, but I mean, I wouldn't.
Well, I think Cromwell was responsible for killing a lot of my ancestors, but I see that statue. I see that statue all the time. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because when the Rhodes Must Fall campaign was happening in Oxford, the student leader of that campaign said that he felt as though he was being punched every time he saw the statue. And it's this elevation of and you mentioned it in your speech, it's this elevation of language as violence, which seems to have been brought across the board. People seem to be accepting this.
Well, I don't know that they are. I mean, a very small minority is promoting it. And I think people sometimes feel coerced into accepting it. But I don't know that people are convinced. I mean, every opinion survey appears to show that people are not convinced by woke.
But you accept that words can be hurtful?
Oh, words can be hurtful, but then I always say sticks and stones can break my bones, you know, but words can never hurt me. Words can be hurtful, but that's it. You cannot go through life without being hurt. You can't go through life without being insulted. You can't go through life without being offended. I am all those things several times a day. Well, you know, as I said at my speech in the Oxford Union, if you can't cope with that, be a hermit. It's an occupational hazard of being a human being.
So to tie that into some of the comments you've made about blasphemy and about comedy and these sorts of things. So if you don't mind, it's not a gotcha, I've just got a quotation.
No, you do that.
You've said, we have no blasphemy laws these days, but with that freedom comes a responsibility, which should always attend the exercise of free speech. Yep. You mentioned specifically here truth, courtesy, and an awareness of impact. And it's the last of these which is so neglected by so much modern comedy. But you wouldn't want to see a blasphemy law reinstated, or would you?
Well, what I've always said is this, that with freedom comes responsibility. So take the Backley and Spen teacher, for example.
Yes.
Do I believe he should have been free to have shown that cartoon to his class? Yes. Do I believe he should have shown it to the class? No. Now, there is a distinction there. Comedy is slightly different because, if you're in a comedy club, nobody goes along there expecting you to be terribly anodyne of speech.
No.
And you take a risk the moment you walk in, and you accept that. But in a more general context, I do not believe that we should use our freedom irresponsibly. We should always use our freedom, not to say, oh dear, I can't say that, but to say, maybe I should phrase it this way. Not because you're afraid of the consequences of saying it, but because you have a respect for the other person.
Yes, I don't think there's a contradiction in saying that I believe in civility and the importance of civility, but also freedom of speech. In other words, I would say, I would rather we have a civil conversation.
Yeah.
If you want to violate that social contract and start being rude and swearing and whatever, I support your right to do it, but I'm not going to approve of that.
No, exactly.
So is that the distinction you mean?
I think that's a distinction, yeah.
But when it comes to comedy, because I saw a very interesting interview that you did with Marcus Brigstock about your
I
record.
tried to get him to understand the impact.
Yes, but you weren't saying that you should be censored, were you?
No,
or were you?
I didn't say that.
No.
I said that he should, think before doing it. I was saying I don't think he should have done it.
Yes.
And I was describing the impact, and I did it by saying, look, if somebody showed you a photograph of their dead son, you wouldn't start mocking the son.
Yes.
Now, we feel very sensitive about the death of Jesus Christ. And I don't think he'd thought of that before.
Well, it looked like he was changing his mind in real time in the interview.
Almost.
You were talking about a comedy sketch that was mocking the Eucharist.
Horrible.
I think that's what it was.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. And you were pointing out that upsets you. And then by the end of the interview, it seemed as though he thought he said something along the lines of, well, maybe I wouldn't do it again, or maybe I wouldn't support that.
What I tried to do, and I think what I did do, and he being a reasonable human being understood what I was trying to do, I was describing to him the impact. I'm saying, look, this isn't a matter of doctrine.
Yes.
It's not that I think you shouldn't say that because, it goes against my religion. I don't think you should say that because I don't think you're aware of the impact that it has. But I never said, but you shouldn't be free to say it. That's the difference.
Because some people in the media have said that you want blasphemy laws effective, that you want to be able to censor comedians who say certain things. And what do you think? I
did not believe that the blasphemy laws should be completely abandoned because they act as a barrier. They act as something that causes people to pause and think. They were never, ever invoked. Goodness knows when there was last a prosecution for blasphemy. I think you have to go back to the 70s. They weren't invoked. Society had got beyond that stage. There was still a law of sacrilege. We didn't have that invoked either. Otherwise, the Marcus Brigstock sketch would have, been done under sacrilege. But I always felt that they were a sort of a stop-and-think mechanism.
Feels like a bit of a contradiction, though.
No, it's not. It's a stop-and-think mechanism. When they were abolished, I wouldn't necessarily reinstate them because I always said, you have to move on. Something's happened, you move on. It's a bit like gay marriage. I've never said, abolish it now because that would be a politician voting for chaos, for legislative chaos.
Yes.
So you just move on. But I thought that the blasphemy views had merit in that they did cause you, or should cause you, to stop and think. Now, I don't think they would have caused anybody in a comedy club to stop and think, because, as I say, if you go into one of those, you expect to be offended. You almost want to be offended, actually. So
yes, some do.
Some do. So I think that's different. But on television, in prime time, in what was actually a very funny, innocent little programme, my goodness gracious me, was the one in question. It was just a funny programme that people loved. And suddenly, this blasphemy of the Eucharist.
That's an interesting distinction you're making, because my view on offensive comedy is, if I'm offended by a comedian, I will choose not to go and watch that comedian.
Exactly.
But I still want that comedian to have the right.
Yeah, that's different.
So you're making the distinction, because what you're saying is that the comedy sketch we're talking about, it was Goodness Gracious Me, was on an ostensibly innocuous family show.
You would never have known. You would have switched in.
Right. So it's more the smuggling of that kind of sentiment into a mainstream forum.
And I was trying to get Marcus to understand the impact of it on people listening.
Right.
Now, if you go into a comedy club, you do not go in there expecting anodyne stuff.
Yes.
It's wholly different. It's where you do it and how you do it.
But you can see how, unless people have the conversations about this, how those nuances are missed. And how it just becomes...
Nuance is not part of public conversation. Nuance doesn't exist.
But that's why it's good to have long-form interviews where you can
I agree.
actually talk about these
The
things.
most intelligent interview I ever had, political interview I ever had, was with Jonathan Dimbleby after I'd made a speech, I'm Shadow Health Secretary, about health service, and had said it wasn't going to last another 50 years, and that we had to start asking ourselves the question, what would we do if we were designing it from scratch now, knowing what we now know that we didn't know in the 40s. I was interviewed by Jonathan Dimbleby for 50 minutes solidly, just me and him, and an audience of health workers, and I thought this is going to be awful. But in fact, it was completely intelligent because having that long a time, he was able to come back, I was able to come back, I was able to supplement, and as we were thinking.
Yes.
And it was a really sensible conversation, and the audience was not against what I was saying.
Right.
It was quite receptive, might not have agreed with particular policies, but was completely receptive to the idea we've got to rethink this.
Yes. Which is odd. I mean, in the current climate, let's call it political tribalism, but people do now. There was a study recently by Frank Luntz talking about how people between the ages of 18 and 30, the majority of those people, over 50% of those people, have ditched friends for political disagreements.
Views.
Now, do you think this is a new phenomenon? Has it always been the case?
In the House of Commons, you'd have Conservatives who were friends with neo-communists.
Right, really?
I mean, you really would, yeah. I mean, you had Janet Fuchs being very friendly with, for example, Willie Hamilton, the anti-monarchist, the very far lefty. You get that the whole time. I mean, my best friend in Parliament was a Lib Dem. Now, that was because it was David Alton, we made common cause on the pro-life issues, etc.
Yes.
But he became, therefore, a close friend. I have friends from all parts of the political spectrum. I have Catholic friends, Anglican friends, atheist friends. I have gay friends and straight friends and old friends and young friends. And I cannot imagine saying to any of them, I don't want to be friends with you anymore because you think this. I'd rather discuss why they think that, or if I think they're too emotional about it, I'll say, look, let's just move on. Let's talk about something else.
Have you ever lost friends over political disagreements?
People have blanked me. Yeah, I have never blanked anybody else ever over a political disagreement. And I say people. That's a lie. Actually, one.
Okay.
One.
Okay.
Yeah. Because
I mean, I know Northern Ireland's a different situation, but I've been into City Hall in Belfast with a UUP member who, and he said, this is the room where the unionists sit, and I said, well, do Sinn Féin ever come in here? Do the SDLP ever come in? And he said, absolutely not. There is no, there's no.
I was very interested actually because I made common cause with Ian Paisley over things like abortion law and moral law and that sort of stuff in the House of Commons. So I got on quite well with him. We weren't great friends, but we got on perfectly well. We used to joke with each other in the lobbies. And then I was doing a programme on the Reformation. And I went over to interview Ian Paisley in Stormont. And I failed to think this is going to be a different man from the quite mellow chap I know in the House of Commons.
Right.
And I said to him, and so now, talked about some of the things he'd said in the past, and said, so now, what would you say about, for example, the Pope? He's the son of perdition and the Antichrist, says Ian Paisley. And I thought, okay.
When was this? When did you?
I made that programme. It would have been around about 2000, and I was still in Parliament. I hadn't left. Be round about 2005-ish.
Okay, because I associate that kind of rhetoric with the early Paisley.
Yes, so do I.
The pulpit
but
Paisley.
This was in Stormont.
Ah, okay, that's very interesting.
That's the point. I mean, in Westminster, he got quite mellow.
Yes.
And as I say, we'd always been, he knows I'm a Catholic. He used to joke, he used to call me a tague, which is a rude word for
yes,
again.
it's a very rude word.
And, but he, and that was perfectly all right as far as he was concerned. But get to Stormont, and it was a very different story.
Isn't that interesting how context
very
completely
different
changes?
Story. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, to think of Paisley being, because even towards the end, he started being a friend with Martin McGuinness, and people I don't think people could comprehend how that had happened. People so, diametrically opposed, finding common cause, or finding common humanity, I think. And so if that's possible, then surely...
I think the Northern Irish situation got to a pitch where everybody was saying, enough.
Yeah.
Let's find some way out of this.
Yes.
Enough. Now, there were still fanatics on both sides who didn't want to find a way out of it.
Yeah.
But by and large, I think people say,
yeah,
enough.
Absolutely. So on this question of political tribalism, what can we do as a society to rectify this? Because it's clearly a problem. And it's clearly a generational problem.
Yes.
That you're more likely as a young person. And I see the way people behave on Twitter and you know, the way they create their own echo chambers. They just want their existing views reinforced rather than challenged. And when you get into that, and Brexit, I think, was the thing that torpedoed this.
Education.
Okay.
I mean, I see it as the teacher's duty to teach children not what to think, but how to think, how to analyse, you know, how to think. And just now, when I said people do not approach the news as if they were doing a comprehension test, you know, they'll only give it sort of half that. I think, you know, children should be taught very close analysis, rigour of thinking.
But that's hard when teachers are increasingly saying that they are under pressure to push a certain ideological line. If we go back to the woke idea, you know, we have recently, last week it was, the National Education Union issuing a report saying they wanted teachers to be activists, to decolonise curricula, to push the narrative of critical race theory.
Who's in charge of education? Government. Government is in charge. Government could make it very clear in the curriculum that, you know, if you're teaching the British Empire, you have to teach the good and the bad, that you have to put slavery into context, you know, that people had owned slaves for thousands of years, that it wasn't a uniquely white crime, even if in, you know, the latter stages it seemed to be. And I think you can say you must teach impartially. Now, if the government is able, as it is doing at the moment, to try and enforce free speech in universities by bringing in a system of penalties, it is able to do the same in education. And the curriculum should reflect, as I say, not what to think, but how to think.
That's an interesting question. The curriculum has for a long time had the teaching of the slave trade and all of these facts of history that kids should know about, I think. And it has been there, and activists are saying that it should be more so. And that there's an argument, there's a debate to be had about what should be on the curriculum. But it's the impartiality issue that's so interesting. I don't feel personally, and maybe you can correct me on this, I don't think the government is aware of how serious this problem is, because it doesn't seem to be doing anything about it.
I think they're aware of it. They've got other things on their mind.
Okay.
And it's going to be quite a complicated task to get round it. Now, just as I think Michael Gove, with whom I've had many, many differences as a politician, but Michael Gove actually understood rigour in education. He was trying his level best to get rigour back in. So you didn't just get, you know, everybody with A stars and almost have prizes. And he was trying to get that back in. Now, you need an education secretary with the same rigorous attitude towards free speech and teaching a balanced curriculum.
Yes.
You need exactly the same, because if children learn at school that there are different views, and that, of course, you will decide that one view is more valid than another, because that is what having an opinion means. It means you've made that decision. But that doesn't mean that the other person doesn't have a right to come to a different conclusion. I can't see what's so difficult about that.
Well, I can't either, but it seems to be an increasingly controversial idea. And I do worry that maybe the debate around Brexit made this worse, insofar as you had 17.4 million people smeared as racist and idiots. And
idiots. We didn't know what we were doing, apparently.
Yes, even though there were months of debate on the subject and people seem to be more politically energised than they ever had been. But it's interesting that kind of attitude and misrepresentation, which still lingers online. I mean, you know, that the Brexit divide is still there.
It lingers, and that is one where people were ditching friends.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
They really were. I mean,
I lost friends over Brexit.
Yeah, one of my fellow MEPs, David Bull, he lost friends. You know, friends of very long standing, because he was a Brexiteer. What's the matter with people?
Well, at that point, it felt as though Westminster as well was becoming quite toxic over this. And I don't know if you can put the genie back in the bottle. You know, I think that's...
No, you can't. You have to move on. You can never put the genie back in the bottle. You know, it's what I was saying just now, is something's happened, it's happened, and you get legislative chaos if you just try to change it. But what you can do is you can try and shift things so that they're going in a different direction. They will not reach that direction overnight, but you can, and I think it's crucial that free speech is actually taught in schools and is taught as a moral obligation. You know, you may furiously disagree with somebody, and you're fully entitled to do that. What you're not entitled to do is to stop them expressing their view, unless, of course, it is a direct incitement to hatred.
So that would be your limit on the free speech issue. It comes down to incitement.
But you see, I grew up, I mean, I agree, yeah, it does come down to incitement, and real incitement. I grew up in the post-war period when people had lost husbands, sons, brothers to the Nazis. People had lost their homes, they'd been bombed out. It was horrendous. And yet, people like Oswald Mosley and then his successor Colin Jordan were able to hold their rallies, were able to proclaim themselves Nazis, were able to talk about the British Union of fascists. And you think how much that must have hurt people who just endured a 6-year war against them. And yet, we believed in free speech. And the same thing happened when the Cold War started. I mean, there they were, weapons lined up, we forget this, pointed straight at us from the borders of the Warsaw Pact countries. Straight at us. And we were fighting a nasty Cold War in which businessmen were seized and were called spies and all the rest of it. And yet, you could still be a communist. You could stand for the Communist Party. You wouldn't get in, but you could stand for Parliament. You could sell the Daily Worker on street corners. You could say, brothers, we must join in this fight. You could say all of that. We didn't censor.
Yeah. So what's happened?
Woke's happened.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would agree. That's very interesting.
And it's what I said at the Oxford Union. I said,
yes.
I grew up with that and I took that for granted. And I could see that was having quite an impact on me, because the idea that, you tolerated a fascist.
Yes.
Well, you probably wouldn't want to be friends with a fascist, but you said free speech. We'll defeat them other ways, and we did.
The question of incitement, though, because if we say incitement is the limit, which I think is a sensible thing to say, but then the concept of incitement has been modified, so people will now say, they will say now, even an opinion that I disagree with is incitement. It's spread so far that even that isn't understood.
You need a really narrow definition of incitement. I mean, it is not incitement to racial hatred to say that you think that immigration is out of control. That is not incitement. It is incitement if you say, right, let's start putting them on the boats and send them back tomorrow morning. That's incitement.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because you can see that finding that line is hard. But when I heard him, for instance, Boris Johnson in Parliament using the metaphor surrender bill, and he was accused of inciting violence through military metaphors,
nonsense.
Right? So that's obviously nonsense.
It was a surrender bill. Yeah, it was a surrender bill.
It's interesting that with Brexit, because that was the thing that drew you back.
Yeah.
So you must have felt incredibly passionate. What were your feelings at the time you joined the Brexit Party?
If you had told me, even in March 2019, that in a month's time I was going to leave the Conservatives after 55 years, I was going to join the Brexit Party, and then that I was going to become an MEP. I mean, an MEP. I was so glad to have got rid of Westminster. Now I was going to become an MEP. I would have laughed you to scorn. But I just so resented the fact that the supposedly democratic authorities in this country were trying to thwart the will, the democratically expressed will of the British people. And I just thought, enough. I just one day literally said, enough. And I pulled out my mobile phone. I was by a Norwegian fjord at the time. I always joke that I stood by a fjord and crossed a Rubicon. But I pulled out my mobile phone. I phoned Nigel Farage.
That's interesting that happened so quickly.
Oh, yes. And he said, do you want to stand? I said, yes. He said, do you want to stand seriously or be a runner and rider? I said, no, I want to get in. It's
interesting to hear that story, and I've heard Claire Fox talk about her story about this, and although politically you come from such different...
Complete different ends of the spectrum.
But she was saying that it was this sense of the injustice of ignoring...
We were all outraged.
Yeah.
Left and right, we were all outraged.
And do you think that Parliament were trying to stymie it?
Yes, of course they were.
Yeah.
Of course they were. I mean, Parliament was adrift from popular opinion. Parliament wanted to stay. The country wanted to go.
How did you find Brussels? Your expression says it all.
I'm very glad it was only for 7 months. I mean, I was dreading, because with every time that the thing was put back, I thought it was a few more months of this. It was every bit as bureaucratic as I thought it would be. It was hugely spendthrift, enormously spendthrift institution. And not remotely democratic. Things are not decided by a vote in Parliament. and you all speak for 1 minute each. Well, you can say a lot in a minute, can't you? I thought it was a farce.
Did you have experience of Brussels before? Was this your first?
No, it was my first.
Because a lot of people say that having been there and experienced how it works, it almost reminds them of why we voted to leave.
Yeah.
That it is a bureaucratic institution.
Oh, I actually said that in one of my speeches. You know, I said, you know, if you needed any confirmation of what this is about, you know, today, this was the day that von der Leyen was elected, in inverted commas. I said, you know, this is it.
Yes. And how did the others react to you there?
Well, the interesting thing is that people rather liked us because it's a terribly worthy place where everybody speaks for a minute on worthy things. And we came along with a slight element of political hooliganism. And when we left, a lot of people said to us, well, you know, we don't agree with you, but you have livened the place up.
Yeah.
I think they were quite sad to see us go.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's not what I expected you to say.
Well, I'm sure some of them were glad to see us go, but some of them were actually, you know, they'd enjoyed it.
Do you think if we voted again now, people would vote to leave?
Oh, yes. Yes, I mean, I think that when you look at it now, I mean, first of all, von der Leyen tries to close the Irish border without even talking to the Taoiseach. Never mind our Sunna didn't talk to the Taoiseach. Then you had Macron threatening to turn the lights off in the Channel Islands. You know? And the more you look at their behaviour, and I've had some Remainer friends say to me, if they had to do it again because of this behaviour, they would vote leave.
Do you think it's spite because of the vote? Or do you think Sorry, go on.
Spite is the wrong word, because I think what they are determined to do is to make sure it's so difficult for us that nobody else wants to leave. And Barnier said that in terms. He said, we've got to be punished for leaving. So I don't think it's spite so much as, look, if we're to keep this thing together, we've got to make it very difficult to go.
Yes, so the punishment for leaving is actually more a deterrent for other countries.
That's right.
Well,
then vengeance against us.
I suppose there's something quite strategically sound about that. If you take that,
if you just look at it as a strategy, it's extremely sound.
Yeah, very interesting. So what's next for you? What are you going to be working on?
Oh, I haven't a clue.
Okay.
I really haven't a clue. And I usually say that because, as I say, I would never have predicted in March what suddenly happened in my life in 19 and 20 and how the way I spent my life then. So I don't really know. And I've given up making predictions about what I'll do when I leave Parliament because they've all turned out to be completely false.
Yes.
So I don't know.
You do seem to find yourself in situations which you don't
I
necessarily predict.
certainly do, yeah.
Well, thank you, Anne, so much for joining me. I think we've covered an awful lot of ground
We have, covered a huge amount, yeah.
Thank you very much. Please join me next time on Free Speech Nation, the podcast.